Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning.
Good morning.
We've a lot of very serious matters to discuss. So let's start with one of the gravest importance, which is, are you watching the World Cup?
I will support England loyally and will probably see some of it as time goes by, but I'm not a great football expert. And
You've never played?
Well, I had to play as a schoolboy, but I was absolutely hopeless. It was never a great skill of mine. But obviously, I very much want England to win, and there is a match later on today, so when people are listening to this, they will have had the result. But I won't be watching that because I'm giving the Speaker's lecture at the same time. So it will be a clash. I imagine my audience will be significantly reduced as people tune into the World Cup, because it is exciting. It's, even for those of us who aren't interested in football, it is the national sport, and the whole country wants England to do well, regardless of their knowledge or otherwise of football.
Since we're on the subject, you don't take the view of my colleague Mark Wallace, who, as far as I can see, apologies Mark if I'm wrong about this, is basically boycotting this because he regards it as a propaganda exercise for Putin.
There was a decision to be taken earlier about whether the British team, the English team went or not, and how one approached Putin. I think we should be very tough in our approach to Putin, who I think is a danger to the world order, and has shown himself willing to operate outside the norms of international law. But if you think back to the boycott of the Moscow Olympics in 1980, it didn't actually work. And I don't think there's a great deal of point in doing tokenistic things that don't work. We also live in a free country. The great virtue of our country is the government can't just tell sports teams not to go and not to do something. And I think if the government had tried, probably it wouldn't have succeeded. And I think it's learnt the lesson from 1980 when the government tried and didn't succeed, which was simply rather embarrassing.
On a different topic, last week, Chris Chope vetoed, in effect, this upskirting bill in the Commons. What's your view?
My view is that the private members' bill system is completely ridiculous, and that this should have been a government bill and it should have had the proper time for debating it. What happened was that at the end of the day's proceedings, a dozen, perhaps 24 bills were brought forward with no time for debate, no time for discussion, just to see if they could go through on the nod. And if any MP shouts object, that bill is halted. Most of the shouting of object is done by the front bench, by the government's whips, who stop these bills going forward because they're not part of government policy. Almost every filibuster I ever did on a Friday, I was asked to do it by the government whips. And the basic thing is that it gives people an airing for their view on a Friday, with the understanding that it won't become law unless it's government policy. And the government hands out bills, and those tend to get through, and other bills get talked out, because the alternative is to keep 650 MPs there on a Friday, which is a day most people are working in their constituency. And that has brought the PMB system, Prime Minister's Bill system, into disrepute. And the Procedure Committee's come up with some quite sensible reforms, which the government's always been cautious about, because, of course, the government of the day wants to control the legislative agenda.
And to be plain about it, isn't there something a bit distasteful about this Twitter mob of your colleagues swarming in to beat up Chris Chope, when Chope has been used by the government for years to kill bills, along with his other colleague, your colleague Philip Davis, and when the problem with the system lies fairly and squarely within the government's power to address, not Chris Chope's?
The issue on the upskirting bill is that it should have been a government bill straight away. It should never have been a private member's bill. Why was it an obscure bill on a Friday when it's a serious issue of criminality? It is a most unpleasant problem that ought to be dealt with properly and ought to be within the ambit of a government bill, and always should have been. That must be right. And that it got objected to on a Friday afternoon has brought it a lot of attention, but the attention shouldn't be on Christopher Chope. It should be on the government for not putting it in a government bill.
And so on to Brexit. A simple question looking forward this week. If the amendment that Dominic Grieve would apparently have tabled, I've not seen it, you've probably not seen it, but you saw his previous amendment. If an amendment of that kind comes down from the Lords, if it seeks to allow the Commons, in effect, to direct the government at a certain point in time, if it's passed, the government's whole negotiation position is in peril, is it not? Because the EU can simply wait for the date to kick in, at which point the government will no longer be in control of the negotiation. The government and the Commons will be fighting it out to try and control it.
The whole point of the Hailsham Amendment and amendments to the Hailsham Amendment is that it should stop Brexit. It's quite clear in the opposition of the Remain group to a motion from the government that would be unamendable, that provides everything that they're asking for officially. It provides the vote, it provides the debate, it provides the Commons' involvement in the process, but an unamendable motion cannot stop Brexit. Clearly, the demand for an amendable motion is to try to put down something that says the government must accept whatever terms the EU is offering, which could be the vassal state. It must withdraw Article 50, or at least suspend Article 50, which would stop Brexit. And in those instances, you would find that we did not get a complete departure from the European Union. And there is very little other reason why there should be this obscure insistence on an amendable motion. In terms of the government's negotiating position, it would undeniably undermine the government's negotiating position, though the EU should be careful for what it wishes for, because if you get to next January and there is no deal, you've got to bear in mind that a lot of Labour constituencies voted to leave. And will Labour MPs really want to vote to stop Brexit rather than to cause inconvenience for the government? So say there are a dozen or even 24 Conservative rebels. What will the position of the Labour Party be when the issue is Brexit or no Brexit? Labour has been very clever and very cautious so far to say, yes, of course it accepts the referendum result, but it's got some concerns. It doesn't think the government's doing so well. Very traditional position of an opposition party. Faced with the choice of Brexit or no Brexit, I'm not sure which way the Labour Party would come down.
That, of course, is dependent on the amendment being passed.
Yes.
And if it is passed, wouldn't the government be within its rights to say, we can't negotiate in these circumstances, we'll have to have an election?
I would be very surprised if the government decided to take that view. The burnt fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire comes to mind. I don't think the same mistake will be made twice, and I think it would be hard to get the 2/3 vote in Parliament for another election.
Ministers might say the negotiating position is completely hopeless. We can't sit here and wait for the Commons to take over and tell us what to do. We've no basis for negotiation now.
I simply think this is too speculative. I don't think you can expect the government to throw in the towel in that way. I think the government will try and win the vote. I think it's reasonable to think that it has a very good chance of winning the vote. And if it felt that its negotiating feet had been cut from under it, well, it would have to deal with that if that's what happened, and would have to look at what means there were of securing the government's position using ordinary parliamentary procedures.
Let's think a bit about no deal, because in this conversation we've probed two ways in which no deal might happen. One might be that this amendment is passed and there's suddenly a choice between no Brexit and no deal. The other is it's not passed, but we get into no deal country anyway because the negotiation breaks down. Just so we're absolutely clear at the start, your view is it not that no deal is better than a bad deal?
Yes, no deal is better than a bad deal, but no deal is not an objective in itself. I don't want no deal as the preferred outcome. I think a deal is a good idea. And I think there's a sensible deal to be done, that they want our money, we want a trade deal, and that those two should be brought together. And that is the essence of the problem.
Let's just explore no deal a bit, because after all, it's quite possible it will happen. The negotiation doesn't seem to be going very well. The government doesn't have a final position. So you've got to look ahead and wonder if it might happen. When we say no deal, I'm sorry to put it this way, do we mean a no deal, no deal? I mean, no agreement on anything? Or do we mean what's sometimes called a deal, no deal? So in fact, there are agreements about the basics, like aircraft being able to take off and land, and the wheels of trade running as smoothly as they can run in the circumstances, which does require discussion and does require a level of agreement.
I think that we mean a deal, no deal. I think that some of the technicalities, all intelligent politicians and statesmen across Europe think ought to be settled, that there is a fallback position on trade, which is the WTO, and that's a significant protection for us because the other countries have to treat all WTO members fairly. They can't say, well, we'll double the inspection on UK goods because we're cross with the UK. That would be against WTO rules, and they have a normal incentive to make their trade processing as swift as possible. So the trade bit of it is slightly separate. But there are some things. What would we do about extradition? We could fall back on the existing treaties that were superseded but not revoked by our membership of the European arrest warrant, which as it happens I don't like anyway, but that's more to do with the ECJ than it is to do with the efficient processing of extradition amongst friendly countries. What do we do about aircraft? Well, the handover of air traffic control will be fine because that carried on between Ukraine and Russia even after the invasion of the Crimea. So some things will just carry on in ordinary international ways. You may find with landing rights and so on that there are deals that predate the EU taking responsibility for it. The issue there, I think, would primarily be cabotage, and that would be an issue for lorries making deliveries on the continent. And so you would want to be looking at issues like that. So I think a bare bones deal may be something that we try to achieve in the event of no deal. I don't imagine it would be impossible because that level of continuity would be in everybody's interest.
According to the Times this morning, the Commission is saying it will not discuss a no-deal aviation contingency plan before March next year.
Well, March next year still allows 29 days in which to do it, and the EU has a reputation for agreeing things at the last minute.
So it's possible to do. On WTO, I want to explore for a moment the question of whether there is a kind of automatic WTO fallback. Because when you talk to some Brexiteers, it's kind of assumed that if there's no deal, we can, quote, trade on WTO terms. But some people claim that there's simply no developed country in the world that simply trades with the EU on a kind of WTO minimum. The countries that actually do are very small, Venezuela or Cuba, or I've read Mauritania. I mean, is there one that doesn't actually have some sort of side agreement on something in place?
It depends what you mean by side agreements. The US trades on WTO terms but has technical side agreements. It doesn't have a free trade agreement because the agreement that was being negotiated failed. So yes, there are lots of technical side agreements, which it's quite likely would be developed reasonably swiftly because they are again in everybody's interest. And crucially, the technical side agreements are an exclusive EU competence. They don't need to go to the Walloons to negotiate.
This, of course, is a deal, no deal.
This is a deal, no deal.
Not a no deal, no deal in which everything breaks down. And your argument about that is it's simply not in the EU's interest to do this because it's in effect trade war and chaos between the UK and the rest of the EU. You know?
Well, does the EU want to treat the UK worse than it treats Russia? Apply more sanctions to us than it does to Russia? This seems to me to be improbable. Certainly it's not going to stop selling to us. And our ability to buy will be determined by our own domestic regulation, not by the EU.
Sort of counter-argument to this, I mean, the argument you're putting essentially has at the core of it that the EU will behave rationally and reasonably. A counter-argument would be, well, it's not behaving rationally or reasonably in the negotiation today.
It's behaving both rationally and reasonably, but it thinks it's got an enormously strong position and that it can get whatever it wants. And it's sticking to that position.
But it doesn't, in your view,
In
intrinsically have a strong position.
No, it doesn't. We've got a very strong position because they need our money and they want to trade with us. And I think they're, in fact, overplaying their hand. But I don't think this is irrational from their point of view. I think they feel they've got a very strong hand. And they quote at us, and we seem to accept that EU law is holy writ. But EU law is only holy writ when it suits them. When it doesn't suit them, they change it. You will remember there is a no bailout clause in the Maastricht Treaty. And when they had a crisis in the euro, they bailed out endless people in spite of their own laws, which they now attach so much importance to.
You argue that they're being rational, but is it really rational, for example, to argue in effect there should be an east-west border separating Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, which no government, Labour or Conservative, is going to accept? If they go down this route, that is the road to no deal, or at least a major crisis, is it not?
They're using the Northern Ireland border as a means of pressurising the UK to stay in effectively the EEA, customs union and single market approach. And that makes us the vassal state. From an EU position, having the UK as a vassal state where we pay in money and obey all their rules and don't have any benefits from Brexit is what they would like to achieve. And they look at what's going on in the UK and they think they're strong enough to demand that. I think they will need to think again in due course that I don't think David Davis will accept that. I don't think the country would accept that. But if they've looked at how the
negotiations... don't think Theresa May will accept that.
I don't think Theresa May would accept that either. If you look at how the negotiations have gone so far, they've got every point where they've stuck their necks out. So why on earth not carry on sticking your neck out? I don't think that's irrational, you see. It may prove to be wrong, but it's not an unreasonable negotiating strategy.
When your colleagues in the Commons say that they're not trying to stop Brexit, they're merely trying to stop a no-deal Brexit, you think they're not telling the truth, don't you?
No, I think they are telling the truth as they see it.
They don't have a secret plan to stop Brexit?
Look, I think Dominic Grieve is one of the most honest men in the Houses of Parliament. I think he is very straightforward and he strongly believes in the European Union. The accusation I would make of them is that they are not following through on the consequences of what they are trying to do in constitutional terms and in the effect on Brexit.
I thought you said earlier the aim of the amendments was to stop Brexit.
That is exactly what I think. But I don't think they are... I think Lord Hailsham is doing this quite deliberately. And I think that the ones in the Commons take the view that these are good amendments but have not looked through to see the full consequences of them.
So the amendments have an aim, but they're not conscious of that aim?
It is not the aim that they are admitting to themselves. And I think, therefore, one can accept their good faith.
And on no deal and preparations and all that, to date, the government seems to have been making its preparations for severance with the EU, with the date of the end of transition in mind. But of course, we agree that may not happen. There may be no deal. Do you think we're as well prepared as we should be for a no-deal exit March next year?
I think you should turn the question around on its head. And so do you think the EU is well prepared for a no-deal exit in March of next year? What are they going to do? Are they going to ask the Germans for more money? Or are they going to pay the Romanians less? And have they thought that? Have they got any contingency plans for the hole they will have in their budget? And although in terms of the monetary policy transfers that they've had, In the fiscal policy, the EU budget is actually surprisingly small, so suddenly losing 20 billion of contributions from us over the 21-month period to end the multi-annual financial framework is quite a hole. And if they haven't made preparations, then there's quite a degree of pressure on them to find some form of agreement that would help them out. And I think this side of it's ignored. I think we assume that it's all up to us. But actually, once we're an independent nation, it's up to us how we regulate our affairs with the European Union, with other nations. We can carry on doing exactly what we're doing for an interim period until we've had time to establish new mechanisms.
After we've turned the question on its head, isn't there a case for turning it back on its feet again and just asking if we're
quite acrobatic.
It's acrobatic to stand on one's head in the first place, and I suppose even more acrobatic to then be able to get back on one's feet. But are we ready for these interim arrangements that you describe? Because my understanding is we need a whole series of legal measures in place to do our regulation in terms of, if we want to, food safety, energy market, trade markets, telecoms, civil nuclear. There's a very, very long list. All of these will presumably need a bill. All these bills will be amendable. It's now June. We have until March to get those arrangements in place. This is a very heavy parliamentary load, is it not? And of these bills, as far as I know, we've seen no sign.
It's a very heavy legislative load for either a deal or a no deal, because both of them need legislation. That once the European Communities Act fails to apply from the 29th of March next year, we have no legal basis for making continued contributions to the EU. We have no legal basis for the transition period. That's all got to be legislated for. The so-called WABE, the Withdrawal and Implementation Bill, that will come forward after the agreement is made in October, will be a really important part of the government's legislative programme. There are so many legal aspects that will need to be implemented by March of next year, whether we leave or not. And in a way, the legal uncertainty is less if we've left altogether, because we will be able to continue with certain things that are in place, because the withdrawal bill has the effect of taking all current EU law into domestic UK law, and that covers a good deal of the necessary legislation, though I accept not all of it. You see, all the EU regulations, all the EU directives that now exist will be domesticated on the 29th of March next year. And that gives a basis for continued regulation and implementation, and that the limited, quite rightly limited, Henry VIII clauses allow for the renaming of regulatory bodies and things like that.
Well, we've agreed we need these acts, this legislation,
there will be some,
regardless of whether there's a deal
yes.
or no deal. The customs bill is due to come. The trade bill is due to come. One of the reasons they haven't come is the government is wary of an amendment that might be laid in relation to trying, in effect, to keep us in the customs union. And if you were the government business managers, if you were the leader of the House, you'd think we were running out of time, would you not?
Well, the problem with both of those bills is that it's hard to see what the purpose of them is unless they have pretty widespread Henry VIII clauses, which Parliament's reluctant to agree to, until after the deal is done, because you don't know what you're actually legislating for. And the government's promised to bring them back to the House of Commons before the summer recess. But however they're amended, they will be overtaken by events, because by the time we get to October, we will have some outline deal on what we're going to do.
You're suggesting really there's no rush to bring them back in this form.
I think there's no rush to bring them back until you have more detail as to what they actually ought to include. And one area where I strongly agree with Dominic Grieve and think he did a good service to the withdrawal bill was in reducing the Henry VIII powers, because that is not a good way to be governed. Secondary legislation has its limitations.
Mm. And on all these bills, to enact all these administrative and legal arrangements, I can imagine Dominic and other colleagues having exactly the same sort of fight over Henry VIII clauses as they did with the withdrawal bill. So your colleagues are going to be sitting very late, as you are, on this legislation by the sound of it, because a lot of it is going to have to be packed in. what's now very little time.
No, that's absolutely right, yes.
Thank you very much.
Gosh, thank you. It's been, once again, almost entirely on Brexit. I thought we might get on to funding of the NHS and things like that, and the Brexit dividend. I suppose even that comes down to Brexit.
That's because you want to be able to tell the listeners that there really is such a thing as the Brexit
There
dividend,
is, yes.
and it is being delivered.
And it's being delivered.
So that's your chance to say so. And so when people say to you, it's absolute nonsense, Jacob, there will be no Brexit dividend, the government itself admits there are going to have to be some tax rises, the IFS says there's no Brexit dividend. What do you say to that?
Well, there clearly is a Brexit dividend, because if we stop paying a large amount of money to the EU, that is a Brexit dividend. This is extraordinarily straightforward. There is £10 billion net that we cease to pay to the EU. That is a Brexit dividend.
It's not 350 million a week, is it?
The 350 million a week was the gross figure. That is correct, but the 10 billion is about to go up quite sharply because of increased
You've always preferred the net. You've always preferred the net figure. And of course, it might not even be the full net figure, because presumably we're going to be paying some sums to the EU to participate in common programmes. That will eat away a bit at the 10 billion.
They should be very small.
How much do you think, by the way?
Very small amounts to be in things like Erasmus. I don't think we want to use this as an excuse for continued EU payments. There are two separate bits of this. There's the divorce settlement of £39 billion. Now, that could have been done instead of a large agreed payment. We could have signed up to quite a number of programmes and paid them a little bit of money every year for it forever. We haven't gone down that route. We're making a big payment, and that, I think, clears our obligations, and we do not want to start new obligations to the EU of any serious kind.
At any rate, you wanted to have an opportunity to say there is a Brexit dividend.
There obviously is. But let's think of Margaret Thatcher, as always, and the household budget. Anyone with their household budget, if suddenly they do not have to pay money say they cancel their gym subscription, that is a dividend. They can then spend it on anything else. And the IFS and the Bank of England and all these people who have strongly opposed us leaving the European Union in all their figures, which have so far been mistaken, carry on with that Project Fear.
Our Remain listeners, there will be some Remain listeners, I suppose, will be saying this is all tosh. Jacob knows perfectly well it's tosh. So any gain from not making the payment is going to be offset by lost growth and lost tax revenue.
I think it's nonsense. We'll have faster growth when we're not subject to swathes of EU charges, regulation and inefficiencies, and worst of all, the customs union. We can actually trade freely with the world. That's going to be an enormous economic boon.
Jacob, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.